All right, so thank you everyone for being here in the snow. It's quite a trip from Salt Lake, and happy International Women's Day. We can thank our socialist sisters for giving us this day. All right, so in June, it's not wrong. In June 2016, I knelt in the laundry room of my apartment building in Utah County. I had spent the week in the church history library reading accounts of the Church of Zion, which was a Mormon group that was formed in dissent against Brigham Young, and doing fieldwork at a fundamentalist meeting house down the street. As I sorted laundry, the front door in my basement opened and a woman in her 30s, Zina, walked through the door. She looked down to ask who I was and how long I had lived in the apartment next door to her. It had been a long time. I explained that I had just moved to Utah and was researching Mormonism. At this remark, she excitedly told me that she was Mormon. In a moment of poor judgment, I responded by telling her that that was fine, but I was interested in Mormons who interacted with the deceased. I know. Without hesitation, she looked at me and responded, "Oh, I do that." Serendipity is my middle name. I stared at her, unsure how to respond, as she explained that she organizes a women's group that meets on a regular basis. The women who participate in these meetings are mediums, healers, and empaths. They are women who speak to Heavenly Mother and have a close relationship with their deceased ancestors, whom they believe are still ever present in their lives. After our brief conversation, she was sure that I had been sent to her by the spirits and invited me to participate in the women's group for the remainder of the summer. The women met in a rented space in an apartment complex in Utah County on Sunday evenings. At the first meeting I attended, 15 women began by sitting in a circle and introducing themselves to new attendees. Each of the women comes from a Mormon background and was raised in the LDS Church. Although not all of the women are currently active members, they all describe themselves as Mormon, whether actively attending the church, inactive, culturally Mormon based on heritage, or fully believing. As the women introduced themselves, they shared various stories that led them to the participation in the group and their attendance in the meeting that evening. One woman shared that she had just experienced a miscarriage and was so grateful for the small necklace she received at the group meeting the week before. Everyone's eyes shifted to the delicate chain around her neck with a circular pendant at the bottom. The pendant encircles a small tree made of neatly woven crystals. She had prayed in the midst of her anguish and asked God to allow Heavenly Mother to touch the necklace and infuse it with her presence. Since receiving it from the women's group, it has become both a source of great comfort and a means of connecting with her heavenly parents. The woman next to her began to cry as she explained that she is newly pregnant, but finds herself angry with the church and with God. She was concerned about her anger because she was unsure how it may affect her pregnancy. She explained that she is working toward reconciliation with the church through a renewed relationship with her heavenly mother. The relationship, which was common among the women in the group, manifests in the frequent singing of a poem reimagined as a Mormon hymn directed toward Heavenly Mother. And it goes, "The river is flowing, flowing and growing. The river is flowing down to the sea. Mother, carry me, your child I will always be. Mother, carry me down to the sea." The meeting of the women in the Utah Valley recalls the broader story of Mormon women gathering together, bound by spiritual authority, to bless, heal, and perform ordinances. Although the history of women and of women's authority has only been at the forefront of Mormon studies research in the last 3 decades, the legacy of this history is invoked by Mormon feminists who desire greater participation and involvement in the church that they love, including formal ordination. Many of the women who met in the rented apartment space in Utah County are involved in these movements and participate in actions that seek greater female representation at all levels of the church. However, unlike many Mormon feminists who seek spiritual authority through the institutional channels of the LDS Church and hierarchy, the women who meet in Utah County in this specific space are claiming authority apart from the church, citing the history of women's power as a force of legitimization and an unseen presence that pervades the lives of believing saints. In her work on eternal polygamy, Carolyn Pearson describes polygamy as the visible invisible that reappears time and again as a reminder of the past and a warning to future women who enter into the sealing ordinance of marriage. However, polygamy is not the only thing that haunts Mormons and calls out for justice. Just as plural marriage acts as a haunting presence that pervades Mormon doctrine, history, and culture, the entirety of Mormonism is haunted by its women and their legacy of spiritual power that is lost in the contemporary LDS Church. Many Mormon women recall a time when their female ancestors were priests, prophets, healers, and seers. Historical accounts of early women are somewhat controversial because their lives support multiple claims. Because they were never formally ordained, the male leaders assert that they never ordained women. Many scholars and believers denounce the idea that women once held the priesthood at all. However, because of the multiple accounts of blessings, healings, and revelations from women, many believe there is a historical basis for the ordination of women. The authority of these historical figures is invoked every time women lay hands on one another or sing to their heavenly mother. In the same way that male leadership across Mormonism is surrounded by literal spirits that offer legitimization and vindication, the spirit of women's authority acts as a figurative specter that is invoked each time a woman claims the priesthood or asserts a religious authority apart from the institutional hierarchy. Since my initial interactions with the women of Utah County, many of these women have chosen an inactive status in the church, or formal resignation, removing their name from the records. However, although they are no longer actively members of the church, many of these women still claim a Mormon identity. Through interactions with inactive and resigned women, it became apparent that leaving the institution while still claiming a Mormon identity is an aspect of women's authority that is often overlooked. Even the act of leaving, for both early women and contemporary Mormon women, it is done through the use of Mormon language and symbolism. The women who leave, juxtaposed with the women who choose to stay and claim spiritual authority within the church, demonstrates the ways that women attempt to claim power in Mormonism by invoking the spirits of their ancestors, including their heavenly mother, and the metaphorical spirit of women's authority that surrounds contemporary debates over the place of women in the church. And so that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today, women who choose to leave. In her work on cultural haunting and literature, Kathleen Brogan writes about history as a means of bringing the dead back to life. The cultural haunting she articulates functions to construct identities through a, quote, imaginative repercussion of the past and to press this new version of the past into the service of the present. Although her writing primarily deals with the construction of ethnicity through the language of ghosts and haunting, she notes the way that haunting is a significant narrative tool for the discussion of women and their historical absence. However, more than simply invisible, the ghost represents a figure that is both powerless and powerful. They're invisible, but we're still afraid of them. It represents both the visible and invisible, seen and unseen. For Mormon women, this language is particularly compelling because it encapsulates the way women's authority functioned for a majority of Mormon history and continues to function through the women who invoke this memory in the present. So back to my weird summer. In July 2016, I sat in a room with women as they shared artwork they had created to represent themselves and their experience of being a Mormon woman. The walls were covered with red cloth and various pieces of art punctuated the space. As women tearfully shared their stories, I was struck by a specific piece of art that hung against the red backdrop. And I want to quick caveat that there's some temple language in this narrative, so if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, I wouldn't be offended if you leave. When it came time to explain the meaning of the cloth, a blonde woman in her early 30s subtly raised her hand. The woman, Emma, began to explain her art piece as a veil that hangs as a symbolic representation of herself and her transition away from Orthodox Mormonism. As Emma described her life, she articulated a trajectory that's followed by many women across Mormonism and a path for life that was made clear from childhood. A daughter of God, a temple bride, a mother in Zion, a queen and priestess unto her husband for all eternity. For Emma, this path was increasingly complicated to navigate and ended in her decision to become an inactive member of the church. In her view, a veil became the most powerful symbol to make sense of this journey. As she motioned to various aspects of the veil, she read from a document that told its story. In the center of the veil is a nude woman, representing both Emma's shifting perspective of herself and the Mormon doctrine of Heavenly Mother. She is holding bees and sago lilies, symbolic of Utah, the pioneers of the early church, and the spirit of perseverance. As she continues to explain, the room's attention shifts to the bottom of the veil and the faint lettering. The letters were not in English, but Brigham Young's Deseret alphabet. They spelled out the name of the second token of the Melchizedek priesthood, the last line repeated in the temple before passing through the veil into a room representing eternal celestial glory. She lingers over the words of the token and slowly repeats, "Power in the priesthood, be upon me." When I spoke with Emma about her veil, she shared that she wanted a way to understand and mark her transition away from Orthodox Mormonism. She explained the veil acts as a visual representation of liminality, quote, "My life as an Orthodox Mormon woman and the space where I can reevaluate what is sacred to me and what I want to take with me and what I want to leave behind." Central to her understanding of the veil is permeability and the choices involved in moving between the spaces that is separated by the fabric. At the same time, the veil serves as a reminder of the Mormon vision of death and the temple ritual that instructs members of the church on the afterlife. In Emma's own words, her death will be a mallet hitting a metal frame covered with white cloth, the imagery in the temple immediately before entering the celestial kingdom. Prior to her grandfather's passing, Emma laid with him, considering his weekly temple attendance of over 50 years. Considering how important this ritual was for him, she was led to believe how everything we do in the temple is preparation for our death. As part of the ritual that prepares individuals on how to die, members of the church act out the biblical narrative and stand in the place of Adam and Eve. Through the bodily enactment of these stories, members of the church become part of sacred history, and they recall particular moments in time when human beings are afforded spiritual authority through interactions with the divine. When Emma finished telling me about the inspiration for her veil and the weight of enacting her own death in the sacred walls of the temple, I asked if she personally felt as though the temple had prepared her to die. Although she answered in the definitive no, and explained that she had not attended often enough for it to have prepared her for anything, she did express a deep sense of importance from participating in the ritual enactment of resurrection and exaltation. She explained, "I think the most beautiful thing that it gave me was a sense of binding me to the people that I love, and I see that as a gift. For Emma, the connection she holds with the entities beyond the veil, her ancestors, the women before her, and her history, allows her to carry a Mormon identity that moves beyond her institutional affiliation. This connection also affords her the ability to move outside of institutional lineages and offer her the power of the priesthood despite it never being formally conferred. For many women who are contemporarily claiming spiritual authority in Mormonism, the spirit of Heavenly Mother is particularly invoked to navigate their place as a woman in a predominantly male space. Although the power of God is gendered male in Mormonism, the entity that the power stems from is both male and female in Mormon cosmology. Unlike other Christian traditions, Mormonism asserts that God is married and that God is a title that describes heavenly parents, a mother and a father. Through Mormon teaching of exaltation, women are taught that they can become like their heavenly parents, giving women an eternal perspective for their gender. However, although there is discussion of becoming like one's heavenly parents, Heavenly Mother is not explicitly named. This lack of naming reflects a contemporary prophetic revelation that asserts Heavenly Mother is not to be directly addressed in prayer, nor is her name to be invoked in ordinances or blessings. Most notably, President Gordon B. Hinckley's word on the matter became well known when he spoke at the October 1991 General Conference and recalled comments he made earlier that year. Quote, "However, in light of the instruction we have received from the Lord himself, I regard it as inappropriate for anyone in the church to pray to Heavenly Mother. For many Mormon women within my ethnographic work, the feeling of absence that stems from knowing there is a figure that exists but remain invisible is challenging. This feeling was most clearly encapsulated by a woman I met, Melissa, who is a mother of 3. Thinking of her Heavenly Mother's place in Mormon cosmology and her own eternal fate, she said, 'My eternal fate is to disappear.' These same words were reiterated by countless women as they considered the eternal place of women in Mormonism. One woman was Eliza, who I met during my fieldwork. During the end of my summer with these women, I was invited to a baptism ceremony that they did apart from the institutional church. And I would argue that this is actually not unique, and especially since we've seen with the rise of the Denver Snuffer movement, rebaptism in the LDS church is becoming increasingly common, especially in places like Utah County. Eliza was challenged by the history of her church. However, despite these challenges, she sees herself in a long history of powerful women that held spiritual authority that was eventually revoked. Although not contemporarily visible, the authority looms over women in the church and validates their practices, even though they are institutionally condemned. As she explained her interactions with historical women, the woman in the passenger seat of the car that we were driving in began to weep as the car drove toward the river we were attending. She had a similar Mormon upbringing with Eliza and was also in a difficult place with the institutional church. She was still a member and has been her whole life. She went to BYU, was married in the Manti Temple, had pioneer heritage, the whole 9 yards. Like many of the women in the group, she was a gifted herbalist and sees herself as carrying on a lineage of Mormon women who healed through homeopathic remedies. As we continued our drive, she also expressed concern over church history, but finds comfort in the history of women, a legacy she continues through membership of her church and raising her daughter as a Mormon woman, though not necessarily tied to traditional institutional ways of being Mormon. As the car approached the small grove near the entrance to the river, we were met with women changing into clothes that they would use in the baptism ceremony. Sylvia was one of these women. She's in her 40s and has dark black hair and a tall frame. As with many women present, she comes from a long lineage of Mormons. She's proud to be one of the great-granddaughters of John Taylor, and I was super impressed with that until I realized how many great-granddaughters John Taylor has. Because polygamy. Although some aspects of the church are challenging to her, she remains an active member and attends the temple weekly to participate in endowment sessions for the deceased. Like many of the women, she is particularly interested in the initiatory ordinance and the power she feels as a woman in this space. Her love of the temple was reflected in the dress she chose to wear for this immersion ceremony. It was long-sleeve white dress that grazes the floor. It has no beading or elaborate ornamentation. It is her temple dress. For Sylvia, the immersion ceremony she participated in this river was sacred as the temple, and worthy of the same attire. Rather than compartmentalize this event as a distinct part of their Mormon identity, the language and clothing surrounding the baptism event was uniquely Mormon. As we changed, the women continued their conversation on church history, including the rebaptisms that occurred during the Mormon Reformation under Brigham Young in the 1850s. At the height of concerns over loyalty in an institution undergoing immense transition, Young required his followers to rebaptize themselves as a symbol of their devotion to the church and its leaders. Although the LDS Church no longer permits members to participate in such practices and considers rebaptism outside of the LDS institution grounds for disciplinary action, the immersion in the river refers back to a Mormon principle and the history of the church that lingers in the background of the river. As the women walked toward the river and slowly stepped in the cold water, and it was so cold, they began to move toward the center and link arms to stabilize one another. Without prompting, the women began to sing to Heavenly Mother with joy and tears. One by one, a woman entered into the circle. The women shared brief stories about their journey to this moment and asked a particular woman to guide her into the water. In some instances, all the women in the circle lay hands on one another, as if to offer a blessing and confirm the sacred nature of the event taking place. Mary entered into the circle and called out to Hannah, a close friend who had helped deliver her child. Hannah held Mary by the hand while also drawing her face close to her, as if to give her a blessing. As she tilted her into the water, Hannah clearly stated, "Mary, today I baptize you." Hannah began to cry as she was lowered into the water and emerged to cheering and the embrace of other women participating in the sacred ordinances of that Saturday afternoon. To onlookers, the priesthood was not present in the river that flowed through Utah County on that day. However, for many of these women, the institutional authority needed to perform sacred ordinances is made possible that by the spiritual power they gain through simply being a child of Heavenly Mother and the history of Mormon women who acted similarly. As Mormon women, the history of their ancestors and tradition is part of themselves, and the spirit of these ancestors is present in the rituals as a source of validation. Although the history of Mormon women gave rise to feelings of power and authority, some remained troubled by their history and did view the many Mormon specters as entities they needed to expel. Following the immersion in the river, the women returned to the rented apartment space that became a staple throughout the summer, and still is. While sharing a meal, the women spoke of their experience that day and how they felt leaving the water. Eliza, who I had spoken to in the car, continued to share some of her story. She explained that despite her sadness and feeling toward the institution, she continues to attend sacrament meeting every Sunday. She would be in attendance the morning after her rebaptism. Her husband currently serves as elders quorum president of their ward and works for BYU. For financial reasons, resignation is not an option, and that's true for many women. But these days, following sacrament meeting, Eliza takes her children outside for the remainder of the meeting and reads to them. She no longer participates in Sunday school or Relief Society. When asked what the ordinance in the river meant to her, she elaborated on the discussion she had on the drive to the river, on the history of the church and the ancestors and the place of women and her heavenly parents. Thinking through these themes that pervade the minds of all the women in the room, she stated, "I feel like I've been haunted all my life, but now I'm finally free." Since her 2016 immersion in the river, so speaking today, she ended up actually resigning. Like many of the women who participated in the immersion ceremony in the river, she no longer felt like she could reconcile her personal beliefs with the institution, and Jana Reese actually points to this being the #1 reason why millennials leave the church. In discussing the resignation among women in the church, the life of Emma Smith is frequently in the background of the conversation. On March 17, 1892, the Relief Society held their Jubilee celebration in the Salt Lake City Tabernacle. The report from the celebration described the scenes as one of grandeur. Quote, "The large organ was draped with stars and stripes. The flags extended across a large oil painting of Joseph the prophet, and he hung in the center. Below it, an immense key was made of beautiful flowers. Below the image of the prophet Joseph were 3 additional paintings of the women who led the early years of the Relief Society organization. Emma Smith's portrait was directly below the prophet Joseph, with Eliza R. Snow on her right and Zina D.H. Young on her left, all 3 sealed to the prophet. By the time of the Jubilee celebration, each of the women represented in these portraits had served as a president of the Relief Society, with Zina Young presiding over the festivities of this day. In the midst of the festive celebration, Emmeline Wells, suffragette and heir to the priesthood, announced, "All humanity proclaims that this is a women's era." Although not bodily present, the spirit of these women linger in the room of the Jubilee, in the same way they continue to be present in the lives of contemporary Mormon women. Emma Smith did not travel west with the saints, and her representation at the celebration was not without contestation. Rather than follow Brigham Young, Emma Smith asserted her own spiritual authority by choosing not to follow the new prophet and successor to her husband, while still remaining faithful to the beliefs that shaped her adult life. In doing so, Emma Smith paved the way for other women to do the same, to exercise spiritual authority by leaving. Many of the women I met over the course of my research referred to the women of Mormon history as if they were present figures, who never passed beyond the veil. Just as Emma's spirit hung suspended over the events of the Jubilee celebration, her spirit also is prevalent in the lives of Mormon women who participate in spiritual authority that is denied to them by the institution, but they nevertheless claim as something that is theirs. Thank you.